check. हाँ, check on check. Checking.
Yeah. We think of scale, the elephant being one of them. And in terms of scale, you may see it is the population or the problems that are faced by Indians, or it is the universities, or it could be the colleges. But one thing where we do not see scale is research. And today we have a panel, a discussion of the heads of institutions with Professor Madan Pillutla at the chairperson, that we will be discovering as to what should be done to be known for scale in research as far as India is concerned. So we have the eminent panel out here. We have Professor Madan Pillutla, Dean, Indian School of Business. We have Professor Rishikesh T. Krishnan, he is the director of IIM Bangalore. We have Shipra Misra, CEO and MD, DRIIV, nothing, it is Delhi Innovation Research and Implementation. And we have Alifiya Khan, Senior Writer Education with the Ken, who is of course the moderator for this session. So not to take any more time, I hand over to Alifiya Khan for taking on the proceedings forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, first of all, for coming out in such great numbers. No pressure on performing. But yeah, I'd like to begin by saying that I've been covering education for about 2 decades in this country. And sadly, the story that I wrote 2 decades ago is more or less the same, or the storyline does not change in 2 decades after, since I began writing. And I wonder why that happens. Because we have more than 1,000 universities in India, 40,000 colleges. This is the brief that came to me from ISB, by the way. 40,000 colleges, 1 million educators, and 40 million students passing out. And yet there is this dearth of talent. Before I begin, I made some notes I'd just like to read out for something that I read a few months ago. Nature came up with a list of the top 200 cities in the world which produce the best R&D. This was based on a lot of indicators: high R&D spend, concentration of the research institutions, specialist facilities, ability to attract global talent. These were some of the parameters, and about 6,000 scientists worldwide ratified these findings. And this is what came out of that, that amongst the top 200 cities in the world that produce the best R&D, India had 4. Bangalore was the topmost amongst the Indian universities, no surprises there, sorry, cities, 97th on that score. The second was Kolkata, 99th. So those were our 2 most mentionable in the top 100. And followed by that, there were 2 more cities, Delhi and Bombay, somewhere in between 100 and 200. Comparatively, China had 26 cities, 21 amongst the top 100. And here's the surprise. Beijing overtook New York, San Francisco, and every other city in the world to become the top city in the world, producing the highest number of quality R&D. I begin this session by asking my co-panelist here to tell me that despite the potential that we have for research, despite the fact that probably a few decades ago we were far ahead than our neighbor, what happened? Where did we get lost along the way? And why haven't we been able to capitalize on this human capital that we have, this talent that we have, the same as our neighbor? Yeah, I ask you to begin, please.
Me? Okay, sure. So very soon in that list, Hyderabad and Mohali is going to be in that. So we see ourselves as catalysts in that direction. So we had a discussion, quite an interesting discussion, and I feel that one of the people who should have been on stage and on the panel is Chris, who's but you'll hear from him anyway. Later on, you'll hear from him. So there was the discussion itself went as is usual when you have a few academics there. So Rishi was disagreeing with some of those things, and I'm hoping that we can have a debate as we go along. So Alifiya had laid out a few hypotheses about why she thought that India is probably lacking in not in terms of numbers. So in terms of numbers, we've risen quite rapidly in terms of the number of publications we have in the scientific journals. But there are some indicators of quality, citations being one of them, but there are other indicators of quality, and we've been relatively stagnant when it comes to quality on those indicators. As papers coming out, research coming out, it turns out to be quite stagnant on that particular parameter. So the question that she threw out was, is it one of talent? Is it one of funding? Are there some institutional kind of arrangements in India? Are there barriers to the way that we've designed our higher education systems and institutions that prevent us from achieving our potential, right? So she had a whole bunch of these hypotheses. I'll just take a minute more, and then I'll hand it over to Rishi to disagree on this. So Rishi's thing was, he said it wasn't a question of funding. Okay, so he said it has nothing to do with funding. It has a lot more to do with talent, and I'll leave him to espouse that. But what I want to just leave here is, because we are looking and we are thinking about what should we be achieving in 2047, when we're looking at out there to 2047, is what are the kind of models that we can aspire to for, because these are problems that have been solved repeatedly, right? So in Europe, in some of the European countries, it's been solved. In the US, of course, in the most spectacular fashion, because a lot of the great universities of the world where terrific research gets done, they happen to be in the United States, right? So in the last about 70, 80 years, the United States has stolen a march over the rest of the world. But also there's been a great leap forward. I know I'm using that word, which it has some connotations to it. But China has rapidly gone up even on the quality dimension. For years and years and years, those of us who've been in academia as long as I have, we only looked at the numbers that were coming out of China. But the last about 10, 15 years, people are all the quality indicators are also going up, right? So that part is also there. And when you think about them, and I look at, and when I point it out, when I look and I try to understand this, I think China, as well as the United States, to a certain extent, the way where they have got it right, is that there are a concentration of very good researchers in certain schools, right? So that that kind of concentration is probably necessary. China has stopped down the policies that they had. In the 1990s, they had a policy, they called them the C9. They wanted to have 9 universities in the top 100 on some parameters. They gave them a whole lot of funding, huge amounts of funding in the 1990s. So those universities, like Tsinghua being an example of them, they rose up in the rankings at some point in time. In the US too, you can see that there are these powerhouse universities that are there. You know them in the Bay Area, you know them, in Boston, in New York. You have these powerhouse universities that are there. India is not it's not lacking in terms of the human capital, so there have always been spots of brilliance, and when you talk about the 1970s or the 60s, there have been scientists in India who've done a lot of wonderful stuff, a lot of great work, but it's been spotty, so there'll be some person here, there will be some other person there. These are truly talented individuals who are doing a lot in different places. In the area that I come from, so I'm in the organizational behavior area. So of course there was a great person in IIM-Ahmedabad, maybe he taught you, Pradeep Khandwala, so he's very famous, did a lot of groundbreaking work in the area that I'm in, but that's IIM-Ahmedabad, you would have expected it, obviously a great place. But another great psychologist that came in India was from the University of Patna. So Dharani P. Sinha, very famous person, written groundbreaking work. So I can start picking and pointing out to people like that, but in a very systematic fashion. It has not happened, right? So it's not happened because there's not been all people coalescing at any particular place. It's not happened. So maybe that is one thing that we need to be thinking about. Can we create a few outstanding centers of excellence where you start bringing in lots of people and they're working together? Is something that you can start thinking about as an institutional arrangement. I do think that they've been in fits and starts. We've had those experiments in India. So Institutes of Eminence was one of those examples of that. But that's something institutionally. I think there are things that can be done there. Funding, I have other ideas, but I'm just going to stop at this. I'll let Rishi and later Shipra talk about. But Rishi, about talent, I think is something that you might want to say something.
Yeah, good afternoon. First, thank you for inviting me to this panel. So I'm visiting ISB here in Mohali after a gap of 10 years, and I'm really happy to see how the institute has kind of progressed during this period. Let me just come to the topic at hand. I'm going to give you a few fragmented perspectives, and then I'll try to stitch them together. So the first perspective I'd like to give you is that I think I would broadly agree with what Madan said, that as individuals we have many talented people, but over a decade ago I wrote a book called From Jugaad to Systematic Innovation, The Challenge for India. And that book I really argued that the problem seems to be when you get all these individuals together and try to achieve something bigger than just what each individual can do. And it's amazing how our very talented scientists and engineers, when they go outside India into other contexts, they seem to be able to do amazing things. I mean, they do amazing things in India too, but not to the same degree that we would really expect them to do. So I just would like to keep that as point number one. Point number two, I just draw your attention to a movie many of you might have seen recently. It's called Oppenheimer. So if you just think back to Oppenheimer, that was in a way the transition point for research in the US. Because prior to the Second World War, even in the US, there was really no organized structure for supporting large research activities in academia. It is World War II and the entire Manhattan Project that established the possibility that large groups of scientists could really do amazing things in a short period of time. Before that, even in the US, they thought scientists were, some people who just lived in some, world of their own and didn't do things which were very useful. And not only that, they could really take advanced ideas and translate that into something which was very tangible and useful. And of course, what could be more urgent than fighting a war, of the scale of the Second World War? Building on what happened in the Manhattan Project and the success, there was a very well-known gentleman called Vannevar Bush in the US, who was a science advisor to the president. And he came up with this idea that Manhattan Project doesn't need to be a one-time thing. You could actually replicate the philosophy and the structure and whatever happened in the Manhattan Project on a continuing basis. And he wrote a very well-known book called, I think, Science, the Endless Frontier, or I mean, the Endless Frontier part I remember, I don't remember what was the exact title. So that became the basis for organizing large scientific activity in the US, largely funded by the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy was the successor to the Atomic Energy Program. The National Science Foundation was, of course, set up to support scientific research in all other areas. So I think the crux of the matter is we actually need Madan's help, because I think what we really need is to look at how do we organize things in a different way. We just having a very rich discussion with Chris just before we came on stage here. And while I'm quite willing to concede the point that at the individual level, talent is not such an issue, I think how we create structures, processes, and systems that enable large breakthrough scientific research projects to be taken on and successfully executed. Now, I come from the government system. There is a very interesting document called General Financial Rules, GFR. If you study that document, you'll realize you can't do any large scientific project based on the GFR. So if you are trying to get government institutions to take on huge projects, it's simply not going to happen. So you need to think afresh. You need to, you don't even need to think out of the box. Even inside the box, you can think differently, and you just need to recraft some of those systems. The reason I say that finance is not the solution is because today, let us say we actually had the money. We don't have the structures in place to absorb that money and actually create results. In fact, today if you try and push money into the existing system, I don't think you'll have very good results. In fact, what you will have is, you'll have a lot of disappointment, and then as a result, things will also get discredited. Just going back to the Oppenheimer thing, the reason all that happened was because of the credibility of what happened in the Manhattan Project and what Oppenheimer was able to do. And I'm sure if you watch the movie carefully, you would have seen all the tensions and other things that were happening during the Manhattan Project itself. You have to allow all that to happen. If you are going to be finally just trying to, do some typical traditional government audit, all that is not going to happen. So I will just stop here for the moment, but I just want to, point out that while funding is certainly important, and while there is a challenge of funding today, unless we put in place the right systems and processes and everything else that I outlined just now, it's not going to happen. I might also just mention one last point, that maybe we also need that one or two big credibility building projects. That will enhance even the government and industry's confidence that money put into this endeavor will achieve useful results.
Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes.
Good. Thank you, and I'm an alumna of ISB Hyderabad, so it feels very nice to see the ISB brand and to be here. And I've been taught by Sir, so thank you so much for having me here. And I'm so delighted that all these threads are coming out and building on it. I feel, taking a step back and seeing what is the problem with our research as of now. So there's not one, there's not two, there are plentiful, right? And which is why we are where we are. Number one, historically, research has been kind of pigeonholed in terms of, publishing papers and at max filing patents, right? Nothing beyond that, and that was the end all and be all, right? Researchers are not immersed in social problems, right? So traditionally, when you think of, particularly in the Indian context, you think of researchers, tied up to their labs in IITs, ICERs, ISCs, and completely out of touch with what's happening in the society. Yeah, so problems of societal relevance, problems of environmental relevance. A third aspect, which I think was coming out but needs to be more clearly and emphatically articulated, is the problem that people are quite parochial in the research community. And I'm just kind of pointing out in terms of the research community, but as individuals, we tend to become quite parochial. We don't have that collaborative attitude, which is very, very essential when you talk about groundbreaking research that will bring about credibility, the kind of credibility that Sir is talking about, right? So you need to have a multidisciplinary approach. You should be able to collaborate with your colleagues, which we are not good at. Then coming to funding aspect, again, most of the funding in our research, 0.7% is a well kind of thrown out data, and most of that is coming from the government, and that too, as was pointed out earlier, bulk of that is coming out only from the central government pockets, right? What are the state governments doing, as we were talking about? You're not interested in research solutions, right? One typical example that we are still struggling with the problem of AQI in North India and particularly Delhi, and there have been talks about cloud seeding. Yes, IIT Kanpur has developed indigenous technology. Again, I give it that it's not kind of frontier research, all the countries have been doing it, but we have developed our indigenous technology which we can deploy. But again, there are so many kind of nebulous issues that keep coming up from the administration, from the various, government department sites, that solutions are not able to find their way, to application. So these are some of the issues, that we are dealing with. However, I would like to kind of point out that these, we have been talking about mechanisms in place. You mentioned, sir, that even if we had a pot of funding available to us today, what would we do with it, right? So, I'll give you a few examples that the government is thinking along the lines in creating a systematic approach to research, so that at least we have the right mechanisms in place, so that, which builds the credibility, and when we do get funds from the private parties, from whatever sources, we are able to deploy them well. One of these initiatives, and I'll do a little bit of publicity of my department. So the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India, they have seeded 7 science and technology clusters so far. So these clusters are a recent phenomenon. One of them is right here in Chandigarh. So that's a regional cluster. It's yet to be functional. So 6 are already functioning. I head the Delhi cluster, which is Delhi Research, Implementation and Innovation. Now, when we were talking over tea, right, one of the issues that came up with, so what kind of mechanisms can we bring and copy from, from the outside that have been proven successful? So clusters are a great example of these mechanisms. And the idea of these science and technology clusters is to create the ecosystem that bring together industry, academia, government bodies, the typical triple helix that we talk about, and also anybody and everybody who has anything to do with taking research from lab to market. So this is what these clusters have been focusing on. We are not very old, just 2 years, so still in our infancy. So the results will, come to show in a few years' time. But at least the creation of those mechanisms has started, where we are trying to engage public bodies at state level also. For example, when I talk about Delhi, we are doing a lot of work with Delhi Transport. So we've translated, working with IIT Delhi and a few other institutes in a multidisciplinary approach, developed charging infrastructure, which through startups and through PSUs has been taken to the market, the fast charging infra. We are also talking, working on battery recycling technologies and, these kind of things to take research from lab to market, really commercialize. We are looking at environmental problems, waste management, water security, and working with local bodies to see how these solutions coming from research institutes can actually be deployed, again in a multidisciplinary manner. Mind you, we have around 100 plus ecosystem members, where 30 plus would be kind of research institutions, not just from tech facilities. So we have IIT, AIIMS, government CSIR labs, but also from the social sciences background as well, who are kind of well versed in kind of understanding the social problems and then creating solutions for them. So these are kind of mechanisms that are currently in place. So hopefully over the next 3 to 5 years, we should be ready to absorb more funds coming in and providing better translational research as examples.
Like she just said, the problems plaguing the R&D industry are not just one. Solutions and the discussions cannot be centered around just one point. But I'd like to take it more specifically, one point at a time, and more specifics, go into more specifics. So before I begin this, or rather before I ask this question, I want to quote something that somebody in this room said, a very prominent voice when it comes to R&D in India. In July last year, co-founder of Infosys, Dr. Krishnan, asserted the need for spending, higher spending in R&D with more contribution from private companies. This is what he said. We need to invest more money in research. Research spending should hit 3% of India's GDP from 0.7% currently. Of this, private contribution should jump at least 1.5% from 0.1% at present. That's the contribution of industry in research, 0.1%. I leave this open to you all. What do you think about the fact that our private industry, when we talk about funding in research and the fact that India has such an abysmal score, you just said 0.7% of our GDP, which is way lesser than any of the other even underdeveloped countries. Israel coincidentally has the highest in the world, and we know what is the leveraging power today. But when it comes to that, even then, like you said, 90% of the spending comes from central government, state governments even lesser, and industries almost not there, 0.1%, like he pointed out. What keeps the industry from investing in research and development, and what needs to be done to increase this percentage?
So, I mean, I think you'll get a better answer from Dr. Gopalakrishnan, but let me just try. But first, I just want to, Shipra, it's really good news what you're talking about these clusters and about the creation of these tripartite kind of networks, right, where you have the government, you have industry, and you have these higher educational institutions they're contributing. I just want to say that, so, and again, this is also a discussion that we were having at tea. I mean, very broadly, when you think about research that happens in educational institutions or outside of educational institutions, it's a spectrum from very basic research, what in America and all they refer to as discovery, right? So very basic research to development, right? So that's the spectrum, and we can always debate. Am I doing basic research versus not? Am I doing development and so on? So a lot of what Shipra is talking about is more towards that that spectrum. It moves towards the development angle, which is very applied. You're taking real problems. You're trying to find solutions based on whatever the research that was done. And there, I think industry participation, it makes sense. Straight off the bat, they will want to participate. They can see the value in that, and the kind of changes that you need to bring about is to assure intellectual property. So you need to assure them that they will be able to use, if they've been funding the research, that they have they get some economic advantage of the use of whatever the funds that they've deployed. At the more basic end of research is what the economists they call the classic market failure, right? So that's the point at which you're developing what is fundamental foundational knowledge, which people cannot they cannot, the returns on that, it is not appropriate. They can't appropriate them. Any private person can't take them. This is a public, what people will call a public good, the development of a public good. And a lot of economically motivated actors, the question they'll ask is, why should I be funding that if it is going to if it is actually going to benefit everyone and not just me, right? So, and that's where the government is very necessary. So even in the United States, when you look at where the private sector is very much involved in funding a lot of research, even in universities, when it comes to basic discovery research, a bulk of the funding still comes from the National Science Foundation, the NIH, all the government, the federal government, even there it's the federal government, that's the bulk of that research that comes there. And of course philanthropists, so, and the reason is because philanthropists, when they're doing it, they're not giving with any strings attached, they're giving it because one is that they want to create a public good, that's there, but these are also, with basic research, they're also long, they're moonshots to a large extent, it's very, very risky. The returns are not at all assured. So, so you need that funding, that kind of a model, you need that funding. So I'm glad that we are developing the infrastructure for the applied end of what is necessary. So for in India, where we are and at this place that we are in, for us to be doing that is really good. But where the government funding should really go, I think to a very large extent, should be in this in the basic research. That's the part in which they need to go in there. Government and philanthropists, that's the part that they need to be spending quite a lot of effort. But I take Rishi's point that that before you pour in the money, start fixing the system somewhat, right? So that that part. Well, Rishi said he needs my help for organizing. I don't know what he meant, but I think that is the real big question. And since he's asked me to help, I'm going to ask him to say how is he expecting me to help in organizing that. So it's back to you, Rishi, on that.
So I'm not going to answer your question immediately. I'm going to skip that one for the moment. I'll come back. So I just want to again give you some context, and I think I think Madan has made a very important distinction. If you look at R&D, this is not one animal, right? There's a whole spectrum, starting from basic and discovery research all the way to translation and commercial application. And there are people who work across the spectrum. So first thing which is important to realize is that in India, we have had some programs which have been fairly successful in enabling this whole spectrum, but they've been very few in number. In fact, Chris and I were just discussing during the break that if you look in the area of biotech, there's an organization called BIRAC, which is a special purpose vehicle set up by the Department of Biotechnology about a decade ago. Under the umbrella of BIRAC, there have been amazing projects covering this whole spectrum. The good thing about BIRAC is they realized early on that if you want to take something all the way from discovery down to application, you need to be providing support at each stage of the process. Second thing they realize is the entities involved will be different. Maybe in the first stage, it's an academic institution. Maybe at the later stages, it's a commercial entity. So you need to provide funding to different entities. So the entire BIRAC program, which has multiple schemes under it, and I urge you to go and take a look at the BIRAC website, provides this kind of support and has therefore also yielded quite significant results. One of the very interesting things, which is remains a mystery to me to this day, is why the BIRAC approach has not been replicated in other sectors. So if one of you find out, please do let me know, because this is something I've been trying to figure out for quite some time now. Okay, that's the second thing. The third thing I want to mention is that to some extent, the question of R&D is also related to the sectors you are playing in. Just take the Global Innovation Index report, which is produced every year by WIPO. There's a very interesting table there which talks about the top R&D spenders in each country. Interestingly, the top R&D spender in China spends about 10 times what the top R&D spender in India spends. The top R&D spender in China is Huawei, and the top R&D spender in India is, any guess? It's actually Tata Motors, partly due to JLR. But the ratio between the R&D spend of these two is almost 10:1. Why is that so? Well, it's also the nature of the industry. Tata Motors is of course a player primarily in transportation, which of course now there's EVs and hybrids and so on, but traditionally it's been not an industry where technology is moving very, very fast. But Huawei is in a sector where things are changing very fast, right? It's in telecom, electronics, ICT, all these kind of industries. India's number 2 and number 3, by the way, are in another industry where India is very focused, which is pharma. But even the number 2 and number 3 are significantly lower than the number 1, which is Tata Motors. So partly this represents India's industrial composition. Okay, I hope it's not my phone. Let me just get
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, good, yeah. So it partly represents the composition. So India's top 2 industry spenders on R&D are transportation and pharmaceuticals. So not surprisingly, that's where your investment is focused. If, as you are trying to do now, you move into semiconductors, you move into quantum technology, you move into industries which are very, very R&D intensive, you will also to some extent correspondingly see a increase in spending. So I just request you to also keep that in mind. But the last point I'll make is you can't look at R&D spend in academia and research in isolation from what is happening in industry. Because typically industry take or give projects to academia when they are themselves active in R&D. There's research that shows that academic research in projects given by industry is a complement to their own R&D. If they are not doing their own R&D, they are unlikely to give projects because they don't have the wherewithal to absorb what comes from academia and put it into practice. So unless industry also ups its R&D game significantly, its ability to collaborate with academia will be much less. These are just, sorry, some again disjointed things, but I hope you're getting some bigger picture out of this.
Thank you so much, and very, very valid points. I would like to bring 2 angles here. One is carrying forward to the sector-based R&D spend that Sir talked about. Again, that also shows the willingness both from the government side as well as industry side, a sense of urgency and what's in it for me. Right now, if you talk about energy transition, for instance, right? Solar has taken off so well. So for the past 20 years or so, right, solar has done massively well because there was a concerted effort from the government in terms of identifying, okay, what are the right incentives to put in place, what are the right business models to put in place, which will incentivize the industry to take it forward, right? Likewise, now the government is very keen on things like green hydrogen, right? So massive 20,000 crore worth of budget been set aside for green hydrogen, and I do see a lot of industry interest in coming and experimenting, even though we don't, it is kind of like a mini moonshot project right now because we're still far away from meeting the commercial pricing target for it. Nonetheless, I see huge industry interest in experimenting with it. So again, it's the matter of prioritizing and acting with intent, both from the policy side as well as from the industry side, where they've made up their minds that this is the business model or this is the sector I want to play in. This is one. Second aspect I would like to bring to the core is we expect a lot from our researchers, right? Traditionally, we've created an environment where researchers, should be comfortable in their labs doing their research, completely disengaged from the outside world. And now, all of a sudden, we are expecting that just like in the US, they go about raising funds and, nurturing startups. This is not going to happen overnight. So we need to create mechanisms and systems that kind of allow first the transition of research, so tech transfer from researchers to startups who can then take it, or MSMEs who can then take it to the market, right? Now there are a few, so my office is based out of IIT Delhi, and I was talking about this to you earlier. You see a huge difference in the outcome when you look at the research products coming out of these centers of excellences versus coming out from the institute at large. So what these centers of excellences have done is, again, going back to my initial point earlier, brought about multidisciplinarity. So if you talk about EVs, for example, right, or new battery technology, rather than just relying on lithium, looking at more kind of abundant resources, sodium, etc., to create those batteries. That kind of EV revolution requires, electrical engineers working together with chemical engineers, working together with material scientists, working together to bring about that innovation, right? It's not just these engineers working together. It's also about, startups, entrepreneurs willing to come and take those products forward. It's about designers willing to come, work with these guys and, satisfy, create a product that is satisfactory to the industry, right? So unless you create those mechanisms, you can't expect that translation to happen overnight. So these are the two angles I wanted to bring to the discussion.
Over the last few years, if we go to see the number of publications, you said that mainly research in India has limited itself to filing papers and at the most going to patent, but it does not really translate in the go-to-market. That's largely true because the number of publications that have gone out in the Scopus Index, for example, it's between 2001 and 2019 is what I read the last. It went up by nearly 80%. But in terms of the quality score, we really haven't done that much. And another indicator with the same report which I was reading pointed out that in terms of innovation, new innovative technologies, which we haven't really done much. We are mostly repurposing, relicensing existing innovation, existing technology. That's where a large part of our R&D is concerned. What you talked about, bringing together a lot of multifactorial factors, like multiple scientists from multiple disciplines, going on for multiple number of years. These are very big ticket projects. It will take a lot of risk appetite. Are we really geared up for something like that, or do you think that even in the near future, do we have that kind of, those kind of facilitators in terms of, bureaucratic support, in terms of industry, academia, whatever else that's needed? Do you think that we have that kind of risk-taking appetite? Do you think that we have that kind of preparation for something like that?
So let me unpack this, right? There are several questions there. So I'll just try to unpack these several questions. So first I think, something, what you're calling just a paper, I don't think it's a problem to have just a paper, which not every paper that is published needs to lead to some kind of an idea that is going to be useful and then used for it by industry. So I think we need to there are many papers that are landmark papers that are out there that have not resulted in what you would consider to be an idea that people have commercialized and taken there, right? So we need to separate these things out a little. So when people are talking about the lack of quality, I think, and this is what I think people are also referring to, and you're referring to the same thing here, is that what they're saying is that those papers themselves are not good enough in their own, whatever be the metric that you're going to be using, they are not good enough papers. Because what happens is that when we are only counting papers and saying that we are using that as a metric of success and so on, there'll be some kind of gaming that will happen, right? So I'll say I'll publish 10 papers, I'll get promoted, I'll get some funding and so on. Those papers itself will be quite meaningless in and of themselves, right? So, and I want to be, I want to repeat myself here. It doesn't need to lead to to commercialization. That paper can be judged on the basis of, is it a good scientific paper or not, right? And that's where we are failing. On that aspect, we are probably failing. We don't have enough good papers coming out of India. We have some papers, lots of papers coming out. Now there is a second aspect to it, and I think, and that's the aspect that Shipra was talking about, is about at the other end is the taking of some kind of projects, big problems that are out there in the world, and saying I need to bring, and this is also what Rishi was talking about, there was a very big problem that was there. It required people from multiple disciplines to come and solve that problem, right? So of harnessing, I mean, if that's what it's called, but anyway, building a nuclear bomb, right? So so we are building the atom bomb. So it required those are different projects. Do we have the infrastructure? And what Rishi is alluding to is maybe we don't, okay? So, and we don't have examples of that. and I don't know enough about here. I do know that maybe 15, 20 years ago, they were attempting to build these inter-university centers of excellence, right? Inter-university departments. There was something I remember reading years ago about the UGC chairman called Yashpal. There was a Yashpal commission. They created these inter-university centers of excellence and so on, where they wanted to bring very, very good scientists to do that. I don't know what happened to that particular experiment itself. But the point that I think Rishi was making is that maybe we don't have that infrastructure for that collaboration to solve some of those big problems that are out there. So I think what, again, so, and we are all probably saying the same thing, is that given the different kinds of research, let's first identify who the different actors in the system are, and then start thinking through what are the solutions for these different actors. Of course, within a university system, there'll also be people who are doing other kinds of research. They'll take the research and they say, I want to commercialize this. There will be that, but not everyone in a university will do that. There are some who will do that. There are others who won't. There is always a great scientist like Albert Einstein who couldn't care a damn about commercializing anything that he was talking about, or like Edison, who was only thinking about commercializing all of what he was doing. Each great scientist in what they were doing, but these are very different kind of scientists. So we need to understand what the different parts of the system are and not attempt to do the same thing that is out there. I do know that you give the example of a joined up system, right, end to end, from basic research to commercialization. That's an interesting thought, but the actors that would have been there would all be very different in each of those places.
Yeah, so let me just make a couple of points here. One is, I think you made an important point about how the total number of research papers has increased and the focus needs to shift to quality. So I think one simple way of doing this, or at least providing some impetus to this, is to look at what is called NIRF. It is a National Institutional Ranking Framework, which is used to rank academic institutions in India. Now the NIRF has a score for research and associated things, but right now it gives much higher weightage to quantity than quality. So if you really want to make that shift towards higher quality, I think the time has come when you slowly need to ratchet up the weightage for the quality part so that shift happens. At one point of time, even quantity was an issue, which is possibly why when they started NIRF about 10 years ago, they put more emphasis on quantity. But today, clearly, I think the emphasis needs to change. So that's point number one. Point number two, I think it's also important to keep in mind that where we have required mission mode kind of efforts, they have been fairly successful. Maybe they've sometimes taken more time, they might have taken a little more resources, but they have been quite successful. Chandrayaan is the best example, but prior to Chandrayaan, ISRO has many other successes. So does the atomic energy establishment. So there have been some of these large successes, but I think the challenge has shifted today. That's where I think we need Madan's help. The place where we need Madan's help is today these monolithic, vertically integrated, big structures, all under government control, are not quite the way a lot of these things happen. Most of the world doesn't operate in these kind of structures anymore. You need more of collaborative structures, you need open innovation, you need a whole constellation of different entities, maybe startups, large companies, research labs, university labs, all working together. So how do we create the structures, particularly for collaboration and of course for management of the overall program, that would facilitate this to happen? That's really the question I have for you, Madan, because I think if we can sort out some of those, we will be better placed to address this. Now, DRIIV, which I spoke about to you earlier, doesn't really grapple with that thing because it looks at different applications for funding at different periods of time. So you can have an academic institution which is first putting in an application at a very early stage. Then there could be another commercial entity which is trying to take that idea and move it forward. That commercial entity can then apply at a later stage. Still at another later stage, some bigger company can apply for support for translation. So all of that is possible under the DRIIV umbrella. That's why I said it's in a way a unique end-to-end program, because it recognizes the fact that at different points of time, different entities will be involved and different kinds of financial support will be required. So your ability to put in place something like that is extremely important. There are a whole lot of other systems which also need to be in place. I mean, for example, since we're talking a lot about the US system, there is a very rigorous and very active peer review system which operates in the US, which is what enables organizations like the NSF to give out huge grants, because there are also very good inbuilt review mechanisms. If you don't, take those things seriously, you won't get your next NSF funding and so on. So these kind of mechanisms are quite well structured into the overall system. So in India, we have some way to go in creating many of those systems. They're still very much in pockets and silos. So unless you can create that larger system, you will struggle to really expand quality at scale.
Absolutely. Completely agree with all the points that both of you have made, and I think a lot of shaking up needs to do. It needs to happen, both at the government level and as well as some initiative needs to happen from the industry side as well. Like Chris sir's quote that you mentioned. A lot of industry partners need to come together and work with the government to create some kind of public partnership, fund kind of thing, so that continued support both for frontier technologies, moonshot projects, as well as translational research, can happen. In terms of shaking up of things, I can share that a couple of years ago in the budget they had announced the National Research Foundation and set aside a budget for it. I'm not sure where things are right now, but the vision was exactly to create an umbrella body which would guide various agencies, DST, SERB, and all other funding agencies, how to build these collaborative frameworks, right? So something like that needs to kind of translate into action for things to spur up. We need some dynamic energy into the system to spur up things a little bit, and then conversations with the industry with intent. Like right now, conversations are happening in silos, but then nothing translates into action. Right, so government has created these systems, clusters, thinking about, but nothing decisive is coming out, which would give the industry the confidence that, okay, so the government has taken this decisive action, let me support it with my funds and let's see what happens in the near future, and this is what needs to happen.
I would have a lot of questions, but I'm keeping my eye on the clock there. So this is probably my last question before we open the floor for more from the audience. The theme is the world in 2047, and I was having a short conversation with Madan over lunch, and we were discussing about where do we see ourselves, and what did, again I keep referring to our neighbor China do 20 years ago, and really it's a question of India is a country that has so many problems that sometimes take precedence over R&D. We have hunger, we have so many other things to solve for, but what did China do 20 years ago? Did it think that R&D, like you said, do we have the luxury of putting our resources, our money, our focus into R&D, and probably they decided that the answer to that question is yes, but in terms of where we see ourselves in the next few years, can we take that similar stance? And are there any models to emulate? Are there any, like the path to get there? Do you see any models that we can emulate that will, give us, like this is a structure that's worked, and probably that's something that we should adopt?
Should I? Is it okay? I'm going first on everything,
That's
so
fine.
I thought, okay. Okay.
We're just going down the list.
So, I mean, there are many things that I think is possible for us to emulate about China, but there are many things we should not, right? So, I began my career as an academic at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. So I kind of, when Hong Kong at that point in time was not yet China, So what did they do, which at least what from my reading of what they did. There have been several experiments, right? So right now that C9, whatever that initiative that they had, has gone away, and now they have something else. It's called first class universities or something, right? So because that was the previous president's, the new president doesn't like that, so he's changed it. It's got some other name to it. So what is it that they did, which I think, so I look at it and I come back and I say, so they picked and they said, especially when it comes to some kinds of research where there is a tremendous amount of money that is required, there's a lot of human capital that needs to like gather together at one place. So they said, we have a lot of universities, but there are only some universities that we can actually invest in, that we can make them great. So we are going to invest in them. So Tsinghua, for example, which anyone who's been an academic knows that in the last 30 years, Tsinghua has climbed the ranks and become one of the best universities in the world. But we've seen it in the years that we've seen it in the reputation, and legitimately, because also, you'll also have to remember that 20 years ago, people were questioning, or even 15 years ago, or even 3 years ago, people were questioning a lot of the data that comes out of Chinese labs and Chinese universities and so on. And a lot of people blamed the very aggressive incentive structure that they had for getting people to publish papers, high quality papers. So there was a lot of faking and all of that. So that kind of thing did take place. But despite that, one has to admit that the quality has gone up. Okay, so that part is there. So they invested in very specific institutions. Then they also did what probably, I remember this, my dad's a PhD in physics. He used to talk about the fact that a lot of scientists in the 1950s and 60s were invited back to India, right? So they were given research fellowships and so on. They were invited back to India to come and do things. So China did that a lot in the 1990s and early 2000s. We know colleagues who are invited back to head institutions in China, their departments and institutions. But again, the point was that they were focusing a lot of their resources on a few people and a few universities, and they built them up. So they built these universities up in a fashion. So so if you go, if you look at, it's the same when I think about even Europe. I used it, so where I was before, so you used to get really big funding. It was called, so the European Research ERC grants, they were called. I don't know what C stands for, but ERC, European Research Council grants. These grants were very big grants. These were £5 million. They were £6 million grants for people in a business school. So we don't need to buy equipment. We don't need to buy all that. So these are very big grants. But what they were doing is they were just buying out people's time, and then they were allowing them to have research assistants and so on. So they were investing only in a few people and giving a lot of money. So that's what they were doing. They were picking and they were doing this. Of course, it is underpinned, and I didn't say that, so that is really a deep insight that Rishi put out there. It's underpinned by very rigorous peer review. So in the absence of that, you don't know who's going to be getting those grants and so on. So there are that is a model that I know has worked. Whether it's in Europe, whether it's in China, whether it's in the US, it's worked where you give these big grants to universities, select universities, you give big grants to select individuals, and then it starts, so then you start seeing a lot of research that's there. What we should not, I think, copy from China is that they use a lot of that, a lot of the measurement that they do there, a lot of the funding that they do that, they use that as a measure of control. No one will ever make any claim that going to a Chinese university will allow a person to have autonomy to pick what they want to study and no matter what the results, that they can live with that. So that's not, so those are bad things to copy, I think, right? So we have to have complete faith. If you're going to do this, we have to have complete faith when we're doing this funding. We have to believe that people are going to be doing it with good intentions, and we have to give them autonomy to pick the problems that they want to solve and solve those kind of problems. So that is not what I would say that we need to imitate at all, right, from China. But picking and I know what I'm advocating is this kind of some national champions kind of thing, which I'm not elitist at all. I try my best not to come across that way. But it looks like that's what I'm suggesting. But I think those are the models that are available out there, which spreading it out is probably not going to do it.
Before we go to Professor Kannan, do you think the institutions of eminence might be the roadmap to that?
No comment.
So let me go next. So I have two things which I have in mind that might be useful here. One is Madan knows more about this than I do, but I've only read about it. But the UK has quite an interesting system where every few years they do, I think its name has changed, but it used to be called a research assessment exercise.
Ref it is.
Yeah, something like it's called. Anyway, what they basically do is they measure for each university and perhaps even for each department what is the quantity and quality, and they have an index of the research which has been produced, and you get your future funding and grants depending on what was your performance in that previous period of assessment. What has happened as a result of this is there's a pretty vibrant market for research in the UK. They are looking actively for people from all over the world who can plug into their system and help them in the next review. And it also means that your funding is almost directly linked to research performance. It has its own problems like any system, but for one thing it's good is that it makes clear what is your output and therefore what kind of support are you getting. The second system which I like, which is I think very badly needed in India, is something China did a very long time ago. So many of you might have a product made by a company called Lenovo. I don't know if you know the history of Lenovo. Lenovo actually came out of a lab in the Institute for Communication and Computer Technology of the Chinese government. That's where it started. And it started under a Chinese government program which said we have all this interesting research that's been done in Chinese government labs, but it's all stuck and it's not getting out of the lab. So what do we do? So they had a very simple scheme. Their scheme was this. They said if you are a scientist in a Chinese government lab, you can take whatever you have developed in the lab, you can walk out of the door of the lab, and over the next 3 years you can start your own company, you can work with anybody, you can commercialize it, and we don't want any royalty from you. And during that period of time you have 1 foot in the lab, you have 1 foot outside, that's fine. Boundary is perfectly porous, you can move up and down. At the end of the 3 years you have to decide, are you on that side or are you inside the lab? This led to the formation of something called Legend Computer. Legend Computer was the predecessor to Lenovo. It changed its name to Lenovo much later. Legend Computer came out of a Chinese word processing software which had been developed in that Chinese government lab. This actually unleashed a whole lot of innovation because essentially the scientists who had something to commercialize, many of them took up this opportunity and walked out. You might call this revolutionary, maybe it is, but I think it's very pragmatic. It's basically saying, let's find a way of unlocking all the knowledge resources and all the innovation which is happening in the government R&D system. And as you might know, for many years that was the primary R&D system in India. All that government funding we are talking about, where did it go? Most of it went into the government R&D system itself, into CSIR, ICAR, ICMR, into DRDO, ISRO, DAE, that's where all the money went. So if you open that up, obviously in non-strategic and things which are not related to defense, you might actually have a different outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, if I were to put in a few words to describe what all of you are saying, one is we have to create a culture of meritocracy, right? Whatever the measurement of that be, but it is very, very important to create that culture. Second is empowerment, right? Beautiful story shared on Lenovo. Again, ties back to more nebulous things, like you were talking about the GFR, right? It becomes impossible to do anything with government funding even if you get it, right? This is why they've created Section 8 companies like us, so that we have some flexibility, I mean not some, but immense flexibility in kind of tackling and managing things and funds the way we want, not we want, but the way it's needed. But that kind of control that needs to go away. So some kind of sessions or sandboxing is required to allow that culture of innovation to happen. Then again, you took the example of UK. I spent my financial career entirely in UK, and I was just amazed with the kind of quality of corporate innovation labs that have come there, right? From the telecom sector, from the auto sector, you name it and they have it. So again, but first what happened was the universities or research institutes were created with the intent of promoting meritocracy. That kind of created a crop of researchers that were willing to create these products that attracted commercial interest, and then all these companies started working with these institutions and set up these corporate venture arms where these accelerators backed by corporates were set up, which started kind of creating more commercializable research. So these are some of the models that are very, very easy to copy here. Why that is not happening yet is also beyond my comprehension.
So I'll summarize the session up in just probably 1 or 2 lines. We actually began our discussion even before this happened with the presumed understanding that the biggest problem that plagues R&D sector in India is funding, and while that remains to be one of the biggest challenges that we do have, but even if, like Professor Kannan said, that we do have the money for it, do we have the talent, do we have the vision, do we have the wherewithal, and like we just saw during the discussions, I think that the problem is not just one, it's multifold, and it's not something as simplistic that can be tackled in a 1-hour discussion here, or just like one committee or one org that can work towards this. It requires so many more stakeholders. On that note, can I please open the floor for questions? So.
Yeah, sorry, but before you start, I just have one suggestion.
Yes.
We have very little time. Maybe you should just listen to a few questions and then we'll try and answer them together. Otherwise, you won't have.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a mic there.
About, I think they have committed something like 3.5 million pounds to become a tech and science superpower. So the kind of volumes and sums that they talk of is huge. So the issue on BIRAC, I need some thoughts. You mentioned about BIRAC example being replicated. The issue is they give out paltry amounts, few lakhs, and now the R&D policy already starts talking about giving royalty to the government. Right? That starts lending. And third, what do you think is holding back the private sector still to contribute to that 20,000 crores for the National Research Foundation? If there is so much confidence in the way system is working, why is there reluctance there? And final bit is on the controls, which BIRAC case also, why it's not able to replicate the tendency to have controls everywhere.
So should we take a few questions?
Let's take a few.
Let's, the Rishi's thing is, let's take a few questions and let's see if we can consolidate. And
Gentleman.
Okay, interesting to hear about the innovation, the lack of innovation in this. I think one of the points that needs to be highlighted is that our educational system is still ancient. I've been in R&D for the last 46 years, and for the last 10 years I've been working out of China. I have my office in Shenzhen. We design products and manufacture them there. There is a major difference between the quality of manpower that you get in China versus the quality of manpower you get in India. The freshers out of college in China are far more trained than the students we get out of India. And one of the reasons is that our curriculum is outdated. I was contacted by a university recently. They said that we are creating a new course on embedded systems and IoT. I said, okay, fine. Give me an idea of what you're going to do. And they said, we are going to improve the latest processors. I said, okay, which ones? 8051. So I said, do you know how old that processor is? Oh, sir, it's just a couple of years old. I told them when I was in college. So we started the 8051 in 1975. And they said, wow. Okay, so that, unless that changes, we are always going to be lagging in innovation.
I'm Samrat Ghosh from the adjacent ISR Mohali. So as a researcher who collaborates with Chinese universities, I would like to enlighten the panelists as well as the audience that one reason why China is doing very well is that they also hire American professors. There are labs which I know, and there's one professor I know who has been incarcerated because he was drawing salary from both the Chinese authorities as well as from American lab. I think one reason you go corrupt when you work with China. Second point, they also have state key laboratories. I heard, unlike us, where you make students go through painful net exams, where a good scholar who might be very good in labs may not be good in writing exams, they don't find themselves in CSR labs. So as a result, our CSR labs have become top heavy. Because you make them go through the exams process, like you have to clear CSR, UGC exams. State key laboratories, on the other hand, if a professor finds that a student is very good in the lab, they hire him. It happened in my experience. Did not clear CSR, UGC exam. So, but he applied for a French group. So the French group asked me about this. I said, on the spot, he solves the problem in 2 days. And they went to the interview session and they told me he's an exceptional guy. But I told him he has not qualified. He has not qualified our Indian CSR. He said, we don't care. We want him immediately. So he went there, now he's there for 2 years. He has been publishing in good journals. This is another problem we face. We make our students go through CSR, UGC exam. They may not pass. They might be very good in the lab. So this also government has to take a call on. One point you pointed out that science in America took off during the Manhattan Project. I think more than the Manhattan Project, I think the Sputnik, the launching of Soviet satellite Sputnik in 1957. In fact, there is a movie also called October Sky, made in 1999, which says that Kennedy was telling his people on a public address that where are we? Why have you lagged behind Soviet Union in science? And they attribute, even now they say, it was the Sputnik which opened their eyes, and then they started taking interest in science, in aeronautics, in space. Shipra, you said that ISR is not doing, ISRs, IITs are not doing research for the society. In fact, I had a lab called Frugal Innovation Lab for Societal Benefit. And we have 2 world-class products for which Chinese agents are after me. It is because the Indo-China relationships are a little bit bad now, we are not able to sell our products to them. So this is I'll conclude here with these points.
Shall we take one or two?
No. Yeah, few more questions. This side. Yeah.
There's some ladies a chance if there are any.
Hello everyone. So I just want to check on one point. We are talking about human capital that is available in India, right? So at what point do you think we should be starting the journey on publishing papers, on getting into patents? Because I feel that we start really late. Majority of our workforce does not really pursue masters or doctorate to get into or to work on research papers. Our graduates, they are not engaged in any of our researches by the professors. Our school students don't understand what IP is. That's the point where we should start if we really have to look at 2047 for a research-based India.
Good point.
One question here.
Like the funds is one constraint. Funds, as you said, is one constraint, and most of the points you covered is basically post-mortem. But what I want is that, as per the new education policy, also we should start creating the mindset change at this young level. You know, by the time we are bachelors, we come to know that there is something like research also. And in the meantime, some of us are married also. So then the research is, that attention is diverted also. So we should start like we create passion at the school level. I mean, that's my point. Thank you.
Hi. I have an observation from the industry finance startup, and with us, a major constraint is to fight for patents, trademarks, and design protection because of the very heavy lawyer fees. I recently found a lawyer who says I'm reimbursed by the government. Why do you go and pay for it? So it's a humble request that the government is already funding these attorneys and their
just one thing. So continuing on what Alifiya was saying before, that thinking of research and let's say solving problems as a substitute. We have poverty and other things. How can we move from that mindset of thinking of research and problems as being substitute or a choice that we have to make, to moving to thinking of research as a fundamental ingredient in solving the problems that we face?
Okay, so finally the question. Okay, so my question was that how much do you all think that the lenient IPR and the patent policies that we have in this country, especially also the court decisions that we have of late, plays a role in the abysmal performance of the private sector funding, especially going into the R&Ds? Because if you funding something which will be not giving you that much of profit, ultimately it is going to serve the purpose of the community in the sense. So how do you people look into that particular part, how that is going to play a role in not getting the private sector into the R&D sector?
Yeah.
I'm an Indian diplomat who has lived and worked in China for almost 9 years, 6 years in Beijing, 3 years in Hong Kong. Let me say that while we should constantly look at China as a benchmark and say that if they can do it, we too can do it, the solutions we have to find should be completely different. We must keep in mind that China, one party controls all levels of government, from center to state to the lowest level. One policy implemented, adopted at the center is carried out throughout the bottom, and one instruction or one goal set at the top once again becomes a goal for everyone down the system. So that is something not easy for India to match. We are all perplexed as to why sometimes the most obvious things don't get done in India, and we are unable to replicate good examples like DRIIV. But we have to constantly look at solutions, new solutions. I think somebody described India as an exercise of redesigning an aeroplane while flying. And that is the exercise we have to constantly engage in. How do we keep the system moving, at the same time constantly innovate and improve? And one additional comment, I know Madan refused to comment on institutions of eminence. I think this discussion would be incomplete without some views at least being expressed by the panelists on whether or on where that experiment is and what is the future of it. Thank you.
Yeah, Rajesh. Right.
I was surprised by the first observation of the two Indian cities in the list of Bangalore was not a surprise, Kolkata was. And my suspicion is, and I could be wrong here, that one of the institutes in Kolkata, Indian Statistical Institute, may have had a role to play in getting it among the top 100. But what I am surprised about is the Congress. I think, to the extent that I know, ISI probably does not have any of the features that we have been discussing in the last in the world this actually. It is an isolated pack of mathematicians and computer scientists and statisticians sitting in Maharanagar, Kolkata, and doing whatever they do that the rest of the world doesn't even, is not even aware of. The rest of the hate, of course, the grown-ups know. So is there an alternative model? Maybe that is exactly the model that we are saying does not work, and yet maybe it has had a role to put Kolkata in the top 100.
That's a fantastic observation. Before we go on to more questions, shall we tackle the one?
Yes.
I think we also probably getting close to end of time, right?
Yes.
So maybe we should finish with some.
Will you take the one on the schooling aspect, because you were discussing that pre the session, and we've had so much. We have the new, the new education policy coming in, national curriculum framework. We have adult tinkering labs in schools. So it seems like we're making some steps in the right direction, but is it too little, too late? Do you want to share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll take a few questions that I remember. So one of them was, I think, this gentleman here. I think the NEP outlines the problems well. It also tells you quite clearly what you need to develop, but what is not equally clear is how you go about developing that. So I think the challenges, we know we want everybody to question, people should work on open-ended projects, you should not make it rote learning. I mean, all these things we know broadly. But how do you actually put it into practice? I think there are some schools in India which are already doing it. IB schools, for example, many of them have it in their curriculum. Some of the better CBSE schools also have some of this. But how are you going to diffuse that across the country is a big question. So I think But your point is well taken. I'm not sure you need to do research as research, but you certainly need to do some more open-ended problem solving and so on at a younger age if you want to develop those capabilities. That's number one. Number two, the second question I can briefly take up is Institution of Eminence. So Institution of Eminence is an excellent program. I think it was to some degree inspired by programs that other countries had adopted. It echoes a little bit of what Madan was saying, that you take a few institutions and try to focus on developing them into world-class universities. Unfortunately, the challenge with something like that is it needs large funding sustained over several years. And you need to really dig into that and have that commitment. I think in China, many of these are possible not only because of what he mentioned about the structure, but also they have managed to, over the years, generate a lot of resources for the government. Going back to the deregulation and whatever started there more than 30 years ago. So their government budgetary resources available are very significant to fund many of these programs. We need to figure out where can we find the resources for that in India. I think that's a really big challenge for us going forward. Last point to which I'll respond is to what this gentleman was saying again about China. While it's true there is one party and all the rest, the Chinese have also been quite good, by the way, at creating some kind of entrepreneurship and competition, though there's one structure. For example, they've allowed many of the local governments to fund startups, to get involved in entrepreneurship development. They create some competition between them. If you want to go up the Communist Party hierarchy, it depends. That depends on whether you do well at the local level before you go up to the next level. So there is, this is echoing her point. There is a meritocracy embedded in that as well. You'll not go up the Communist Party hierarchy unless you are able to show results. So there is other elements. There are decentralized elements to what is otherwise a centralized structure, and that's what helps a lot of these things to bubble up. These are the 2 or 3 things which many of the other comments were more in the nature of observations. I'm not sure we need to address them, but these are the 3 questions which I remember, which I thought I should respond to.
There was one observation which could also be a question. Something about the gentleman said about we have talented students, but they can't clear these entry-level bar exams. Yeah. And this is just one of the bureaucratic challenges. There's so many others. Yeah, how do we sift through those?
I'm not very acquainted with the Chinese system, but China has its own exams. It's not as though they don't have exams. I think traditionally they also have, maybe you would know better, there are some important exams you need to clear if you want to advance. So I think China also has its own stuff somewhere. We need to go into that in a bit more detail. That's my suspicion.
There's a question here. Yes, please.
No, it's an observation since we've been talking about the funding and the government role in research promotion, etc. I would just like to share one scheme in terms of its design for promoting research. Now there is this scheme which was launched in 2018 by MHRD known as Scheme for Promotion of Academic and Research Collaboration, SPARC. So there's a list of 400-500 Indian institutes and 400-500 institutes abroad in different countries, and you can collaborate with, out of this list you can collaborate with any of them. And so in 2019 they introduced humanities as well in social sciences in the scheme. So that is where I'm a professor of economics, we had applied, and then probably we thought that COVID has eaten it away, and so it's done. It was in September, 30th September 2019 was the deadline for application. So in June of 2023, we get an email to say that, oh, you are selected for this project. 29th of July 2023, they say that from today onwards, the process starts and 2 years for the project, and your collaborators are sitting elsewhere in the world. You need to talk to them that it has, revived. So by the time we all discussed this, 3 of us were already about to superannuate. and then now we got an email to say that we are going to send you the first installment of funds, but you will have to spend them by 31st of March 24 to get the next installment. So if the design of the scheme for promotion of research is such, that 40-50 lakhs, 1 crore, whatever somebody has got is a total waste, because it just shows on paper that it has been allocated. We cannot use it for research.
I think you're only reinforcing, ma'am, the point we all of us made earlier that systemic changes need to happen.
I'm saying that it is so recent that not only the older schemes are not doing well, but I mean this has been done just now. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think
Thank
there's
you.
a better
Yeah.
comment
Yeah,
to
yeah,
end
we'll
this
wrap it.
unless and until there's another question.
No,
But
no, we'll wrap
this is the best observation to wrap it up on. I mean, this is exactly where the problem with our R&D growth lies. So unless and until we find a solution to this,
Yeah.
I don't know how we move past that.
So I mean, I'm getting many signs that we've overstayed our welcome, right?
Yes.
So there are many people signing, including people yawning. and
Is
stuff.
that people doing that or?
So no, I think we're done. I really think we're done. Thank you very much.
We can
This
take the
is-
questions on the floor.
Yeah, we can. Once people can get up, they can stretch their legs, get a coffee, and so on. But we'll carry on these somewhat pessimistic conversations that are that have unfolded here.
Largely pessimistic.
We were supposed to lay out some kind of a plan for the future, but we'll get there.
Diagnosing the problem is a good first step.
Okay. So with that, we stop here. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rishi.
Okay, thank you very much. In line with the tagline, ISB Insights, I feel we have had a very insightful discussion. And to close the proceedings, may I now request Dean Madan Pillutla to give a memento, present mementos to our panelists. Yeah. So first is, of course, Alifiya Khan. Then Professor Rishikesh. And Shipra. So I request all of you, you can stretch your legs with a hot cup of tea and then come back here by 6 o'clock for the grand finale, which is a